Have you ever felt like, no matter how hard you try, life just keeps pushing you down? Like every time you take one step forward, you're shoved two steps back. If you have, you're not alone. Let me tell you about Sarah. Sarah was a single mother, doing everything she could to provide for her little boy, Jake. To Sarah, Jake was her world, her reason to keep going. She worked long hours at a small restaurant, balancing every penny to make sure Jake had what he needed. Every night, she would fall into bed exhausted but satisfied, knowing that her hard work kept their little family afloat. But Sarah wasn't just hardworking. She was a woman of faith. She believed that as long as she stayed strong and trusted in God, things would eventually get better. She would often tell Jake, "Sweetheart, one day life is going to be so much better for us, I promise." And Jake believed her because he saw the determination in her eyes. But as much as Sarah believed in hard work and faith, life doesn't always go according to plan. Challenges have a way of testing even the strongest among us. And for Sarah, those challenges were just around the corner. Little did she know, her world was about to be turned upside down. In the face of heartbreak and despair, she would have to decide whether to hold on to her faith or let it slip away. This is Sarah's story, a journey of struggle, resilience, and rediscovering hope in the most unexpected places. Sarah worked full-time at a small family-owned restaurant, doing everything from taking orders to cleaning up at the end of long, exhausting shifts. The pay wasn't great, but it was just enough to cover the basics: rent for their tiny apartment, groceries, and the occasional treat for her son, Jake. Sarah never complained though. She was grateful for what they had, even if it wasn't much. Her life revolved around Jake. At just 7 years old, Jake was the light of her life, her reason to wake up every morning and push through the struggles of each day. Every choice Sarah made was for him. Every sacrifice was done with one goal in mind: to give her boy a better future. "Mommy, why do you work so much?" Jake had asked her one evening, his big brown eyes filled with curiosity. "Because one day," Sarah replied, with a tired but determined smile, "I'm going to make sure you have a life where you don't have to worry about money. One day, sweetheart, everything will be easier for us." Jake nodded solemnly, as if he understood more than any 7-year-old should. "I believe you, Mommy." Those words, so simple and innocent, fueled Sarah's determination. She couldn't fail him. She wouldn't fail him. Life wasn't easy, but Sarah always told herself that if she kept working hard and stayed strong, better days would come. She had faith in God's plan, even when she couldn't see it. Every Sunday, she and Jake would go to church, where she prayed for strength and guidance. "Just a little more time, Lord," she would whisper. "I'll keep going. Just help me stay strong." Still, there were moments of doubt, moments when the weight of bills, fatigue, and endless responsibility felt unbearable. But Sarah refused to give up. Giving up wasn't an option. Jake depended on her. For Sarah, life wasn't perfect, but it was manageable. She had built a delicate balance, held together by faith, love, and grit. Little did she know, that balance was about to be shattered. One gray morning, just as Sarah was finishing up her shift at the restaurant, the owner called her into the small back office. His face looked heavy, his eyes unable to meet hers. Sarah's stomach dropped. She had a bad feeling, but she didn't know why. "I'm really sorry, Sarah," he began, fidgeting with the papers on his desk. "But we're closing the restaurant. Business has been rough for a while and I just can't keep it running anymore." The words hit her like a punch to the chest. "What?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "You mean I'm out of a job? Just like that?" He nodded, his face etched with guilt. "I wish there was something I could do, but it's over. I'll give you your final paycheck today." Sarah left the office in a daze, her mind racing. This job had been their lifeline, the only thing keeping a roof over her and Jake's heads. And now, it was gone, without warning, without time to prepare. She gripped the small envelope with her last paycheck inside, knowing it wouldn't stretch far enough. That evening, Sarah sat on the edge of her bed, staring at the numbers on her bank statement. They weren't enough. Rent was due in 2 weeks, Jake needed school supplies, and there was barely enough for groceries. She felt tears well up, but forced them down. She had to be strong. Jake needed her to be strong. The next morning, Sarah began her search for a new job. She walked from one business to another, filling out applications, asking for any position they might have. But time after time, the answer was the same: "We're not hiring," or worse, "You don't have the right experience." Her lack of specialized skills and her inability to work late-night shifts because of Jake made her a less than ideal candidate. Every rejection chipped away at her hope. By the third day, her feet ached, her pride was bruised, and her optimism had all but disappeared. That evening, she sat at the kitchen table, staring at the classified section of the newspaper, circling jobs that required skills she didn't have. Her hands trembled as she traced over the words. But no matter how impossible things felt, Sarah refused to let despair take over. She looked at a photo of Jake on the fridge, a drawing he had made of the two of them, holding hands with the words "My hero" scrawled underneath. She wiped her tears and whispered to herself, "I can't give up. Jake needs me. I'll figure something out." For the first time in days, she knelt beside her bed and prayed, "Lord, I don't know what to do. Please guide me. Please help me find a way." Even though there was no answer, she took a deep breath and resolved to keep trying. She didn't have the luxury of stopping. As Sarah trudged through days of job hunting, she began to notice something wasn't right. Jake wasn't his usual cheerful self. He seemed more tired than usual and had developed a persistent cough. At first, she brushed it off as a common cold. "He'll bounce back," she told herself, trying to stay optimistic. But as the days passed, Jake's condition worsened. His cough grew deeper and his small body burned with fever. One night, as Sarah prepared a simple dinner, Jake sat at the table, his head resting on his arms. When she called him to eat, he barely lifted his head. Alarmed, Sarah rushed to his side, placing her hand on his forehead. His skin was scorching hot. "Jake," she whispered, her voice trembling, "we're going to the hospital right now." The emergency room was cold and crowded, the air thick with tension. Sarah clutched Jake's small hand as they waited for hours to see a doctor. When their turn finally came, the doctor examined Jake, his face growing serious. "Your son has pneumonia," he said gently. "We'll need to admit him immediately for treatment. It's critical to get this under control." Sarah's heart sank. "How much will this cost?" she asked, dreading the answer. The doctor hesitated. "Without insurance, it will be expensive. You'll need to discuss payment with the billing department." As Jake was wheeled into a hospital room, Sarah sat in the waiting area, her mind racing. The bills, they would be astronomical. She didn't have insurance. She didn't even have a steady income anymore. How was she going to pay for this? The weight of it all felt crushing. The next morning, Sarah met with the hospital's billing department. They explained the costs in cold, clinical terms. She tried to negotiate, to plead for leniency, but there was little they could do. "We'll need a deposit to begin treatment," the clerk said firmly. Sarah left the office with tears streaming down her face. She felt trapped, helpless. Jake needed her to act, but she didn't have the resources. She thought about asking for help, but who could she turn to? She'd already borrowed money from friends for rent last month. There was no one else to call. Later that day, as she sat by Jake's bedside, her eyes landed on her left hand, on the simple gold band she still wore, her wedding ring. It was the last piece of her past life, the only thing she had left to remind her of happier times. It wasn't worth much, but maybe it could cover part of the deposit. The thought of selling it broke her heart, but she didn't hesitate. The next morning, Sarah walked into a small pawn shop with trembling hands. She slid the ring across the counter, her voice barely above a whisper. "How much can I get for this?" The man behind the counter inspected it briefly before replying. "It's a nice ring, but it's not worth much. I can give you $150. Sarah felt her chest tighten. That ring had once symbolized love, hope, and a future she believed in. Now it was just a transaction, a desperate attempt to save her son. "It's fine," she said, her voice cracking. "I'll take it." When she handed over the deposit at the hospital later that day, Sarah couldn't stop the tears from falling. She had nothing left. Nothing but Jake. She sat beside his bed, stroking his hair, and whispered, "You're going to get better, baby. I'll do whatever it takes." In that moment, Sarah felt a strange mix of grief and determination. She had given up the last remnant of her past, but she told herself, it was worth it. Jake was her future, and she would sacrifice everything for him. As Jake began to recover, Sarah felt a small flicker of hope returning to her heart. He was still weak, but his fever had broken, and the doctors assured her that, with time, he would regain his strength. The relief of seeing her son smile again gave Sarah the push she needed to keep fighting. She knew she couldn't afford to wait any longer to find a job. One morning, while flipping through the local newspaper, Sarah spotted an ad for a job fair happening nearby. This is it, she thought. It was her chance to start fresh. She borrowed a clean blouse from a neighbor, scraped together the bus fare, and headed out with a folder of resumes she had hastily typed up at the public library. The job fair was bustling with activity. Booths lined the room, each with eager recruiters handing out flyers and collecting applications. Sarah's nerves kicked in as she made her way through the crowd. She approached several tables, handing over her resume and answering questions about her work history. But time and again she heard the same polite but discouraging phrases. "We're looking for someone with more experience," or "This role requires late-night availability." Just as despair began to creep in, a well-dressed man approached her. He had a warm smile and an air of confidence that immediately put Sarah at ease. "You're looking for work?" he asked kindly. "Yes, I am," Sarah replied, her voice tinged with hope. "Well, you're in luck," he said. "I'm hiring for a new administrative position at my company. It's flexible hours, good pay, perfect for someone like you." Sarah's heart soared. It sounded too good to be true, but she wanted to believe it. "Really? That sounds amazing," she said, clutching her folder. The man nodded. "There's just a small processing fee to handle your application and set up your training. $50 should cover it." Sarah hesitated. $50 was all she had left, the money she'd saved for groceries to get through the week. But the promise of a steady income and stability for Jake outweighed her doubts. "Okay," she said, pulling the cash from her worn wallet and handing it over. The man smiled, pocketing the money. "Great. I'll be in touch soon. You'll hear from me by the end of the week." He handed her a business card and walked away. For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a sense of relief. Things were finally turning around. She returned home that evening with a smile, already picturing what she'd do with her first paycheck. But days passed, and the phone never rang. Sarah tried calling the number on the business card, only to be met with a disconnected tone. Panic set in as she realized the truth. She had been scammed. The man, with his kind smile and promises, had vanished without a trace. Sarah sat at her kitchen table, the empty envelope where her $50 had been sitting in front of her. Tears streamed down her face as the weight of her mistakes pressed down on her. She had been so desperate to believe in something good that she ignored her instincts. Now, she was left with nothing. "Why, God?" she whispered, her voice breaking. "Why does this keep happening to me? What did I do to deserve this? I've tried so hard, but everything I do just falls apart." In that moment, Sarah felt completely defeated, not just by her circumstances, but by life itself. The small glimmer of faith she had been holding on to felt dimmer than ever. For the first time, she wondered if she even had the strength to keep going. One rainy afternoon, Sarah found herself sitting on a bench at the bus stop, staring blankly at the wet pavement. Her umbrella lay forgotten at her side, as raindrops trickled down her hair and soaked her clothes. She didn't care. She had nothing left. No job, no money, no hope. The world felt impossibly heavy, and she couldn't hold back the sobs that escaped her chest. "Excuse me, dear," came a gentle voice beside her. Sarah startled and turned to see an older woman sitting down, clutching a large tote bag and an umbrella. Her face was lined with age, but her eyes radiated warmth and understanding. "I couldn't help but notice," the woman continued softly. "You look like you've got the weight of the world on your shoulders." Sarah wiped her face with the back of her hand, embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she mumbled. "I didn't mean to make a scene." "There's no need to apologize," the woman replied. "Sometimes we just need someone to listen. Would you like to tell me what's wrong?" At first, Sarah hesitated. She didn't even know this woman, but the kindness in her voice was so genuine that something inside Sarah cracked open. Before she could stop herself, she poured out her story. The job she lost, Jake's illness, selling her wedding ring, and the scam that had taken her last $50. She spoke through tears, her voice trembling with every word. By the time she finished, she felt strangely lighter, as if sharing her pain had eased the burden just a little. The older woman nodded thoughtfully. "You've been through so much," she said, "but you're still here. That means something." Sarah shook her head. "I don't know if I can keep going. Every time I try to get back up, life just knocks me down again. I don't know what to do anymore." The woman reached over and gently placed a hand on Sarah's shoulder. "Listen to me, child. I know it feels like the world is against you right now, but sometimes, when we're at our lowest, that's when the biggest blessings come. You just have to trust that things will get better, even when you can't see the way." Sarah sniffled, unsure of what to say. "I have a small bakery not far from here," the woman continued. "It's nothing fancy, but it's mine, and I could use some help around the shop. It's not much, but it's honest work. What do you think?" Sarah's first instinct was to refuse. She didn't know anything about baking, and the thought of starting over in yet another unfamiliar place felt overwhelming. But then she thought of Jake, his little face looking up at her with trust and hope. She didn't have the luxury of turning down an opportunity, no matter how small it seemed. I don't know much about baking," Sarah admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman smiled. "That's all right, I'll teach you. Sometimes all you need is a fresh start." For the first time in weeks, Sarah felt a glimmer of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Possibility. "Okay," she said quietly. "I'll give it a try." As the woman stood to leave, she looked back at Sarah and said one last thing. "Remember, child, sometimes faith isn't about seeing the whole path. It's about taking the first step." The next day, Sarah showed up at the small bakery, nervous but determined. The shop smelled of fresh bread and sweet pastries, the air warm and inviting. It was a humble place, with worn wooden floors and shelves lined with simple but lovingly made treats. The older woman, whose name was Margaret, greeted her with a smile and handed her an apron. "Let's start simple," Margaret said, showing Sarah around the shop. "You can help with cleaning, restocking, and taking care of customers. The rest will come with time." Sarah threw herself into the work. At first, her tasks were basic: sweeping the floors, wiping down counters, and arranging pastries in the display case. She wasn't used to the rhythm of the bakery, and the early mornings were exhausting. But for the first time in months, she felt a sense of purpose, however small it was. As the days turned into weeks, Sarah began to pay closer attention to the baking itself. She watched Margaret skillfully knead dough, pipe frosting, and sprinkle powdered sugar over cakes. There was a quiet artistry to it, a sense of care and patience that Sarah found captivating. One day, as Margaret was decorating a batch of cupcakes, she looked up and smiled. "Why don't you give it a try?" she said, handing Sarah a piping bag. Sarah hesitated. "I've never done this before. I'll probably ruin them." Margaret chuckled. "You'll never know unless you try." Taking a deep breath, Sarah squeezed the bag, her hands trembling as she carefully swirled frosting onto a cupcake. It wasn't perfect, but it wasn't bad either. Margaret nodded approvingly. Not bad at all. With a little practice, you might just have a knack for this. Encouraged by Margaret's patience and support, Sarah began learning more about the baking process. She started with simple tasks like rolling dough and measuring ingredients. But before long, she was experimenting with decorating techniques and flavor combinations. The more she learned, the more confident she became. One quiet afternoon, as Sarah kneaded a batch of dough, an idea struck her. Jake had always loved turtles. He had drawings of them all over their fridge at home. What if she could create a turtle-shaped pastry? Something playful and unique. That evening, after her shift, Sarah stayed late at the bakery, sketching designs and experimenting with dough shapes. By the end of the night, she had crafted a small turtle-shaped bread roll, complete with chocolate eyes and a sprinkle of sugar on its shell. The next morning, Sarah nervously presented her creation to Margaret. "It's just an idea," she said, her cheeks flushing. "I thought it might be fun to try something different." Margaret's face lit up as she examined the pastry. "Sarah, this is wonderful. Let's add it to the display and see how it does." The turtle pastries quickly became a hit. Customers loved the whimsical design, and children especially were drawn to them. Word spread, and soon people were stopping by the bakery just to try Sarah's turtles. With each passing day, Sarah's confidence grew. She began experimenting with more designs and flavors, adding her own creative touch to the bakery's menu. Margaret watched proudly as Sarah flourished, no longer the hesitant, uncertain woman who had walked into her shop weeks ago. "Sarah," Margaret said one evening as they closed up shop, "you've brought new life to this bakery. You've got a gift, not just for baking, but for creating things that make people smile. Don't stop now." Sarah looked at her hands, still dusted with flour, and smiled. For the first time in a long time, she felt proud of herself. This wasn't just a job anymore. It was a place where she could create, grow, and provide for Jake in a way she'd never imagined. As she walked home that night, carrying a small box of turtle pastries for Jake, Sarah felt something she hadn't felt in months. Hope. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. She was building something new, something better, for herself. And for her son. As weeks turned into months, Sarah's turtle-shaped pastries became a beloved item at the bakery. Customers came not only for the adorable design, but also for the warmth and care they felt in each bite. Encouraged by their enthusiasm, Sarah began experimenting with new creations. Breads shaped like animals, cakes with intricate patterns, and cookies inspired by children's drawings. Slowly but surely, her creations became a symbol of the bakery's charm. Margaret noticed the change too. One evening, after closing the shop, she sat Sarah down with a knowing smile. "Sarah, you've brought something special to this place. It's not just about the pastries. It's the joy, the connection, the love you pour into everything you do." Sarah looked at Margaret, her heart swelling with gratitude. "I've learned so much here, but honestly, it's because you believed in me, when I didn't even believe in myself." Margaret's expression turned serious but kind. "And now it's time for you to believe in yourself fully. I want you to be my partner in this bakery. You've earned it." Sarah froze. Partner? Just a year ago, she had been sitting in despair, wondering how she would keep Jake fed. Now, this opportunity was being handed to her. "I don't know what to say," Sarah stammered, tears welling up. "Thank you, Margaret. I'll do my best." The next day, Sarah shared the news with Jake, and his face lit up with joy. "So, you're the boss now?" he asked, grinning. "Something like that," Sarah said, pulling him into a hug. "It means we're going to be okay." That night, as Sarah lay in bed, she thought back on her journey. The pain of losing her job, the fear and helplessness during Jake's illness, the humiliation of being scammed. It had all felt so devastating at the time, but now, she could see how each trial had pushed her forward. Losing her job forced her to let go of her comfort zone. Jake's illness had taught her the strength of a mother's love. Being scammed humbled her and reminded her to stay vigilant. And meeting Margaret had opened a door she never would have found on her own. "I thought God had abandoned me," Sarah whispered into the quiet night. "But now I see, He was there all along. Every hardship was part of His plan, preparing me for something greater." The following week, the bakery celebrated Sarah's partnership with a special event. Sarah unveiled her newest creation, a turtle-shaped cake, layered with rich chocolate and a touch of sweetness. It wasn't just a cake, it was a symbol of resilience, of the journey that had brought her here. Customers flooded in, eager to support her and Margaret, and the bakery thrived like never before. Each evening, as Sarah walked home hand in hand with Jake, she felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The challenges hadn't disappeared, there were still bills to pay and long days of work, but she faced them with a new perspective. She no longer saw struggles as walls, but as stepping stones. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered one night, gazing at the stars outside her window. "For every tear, every trial, every lesson, your plan was always greater than my pain. I just didn't see it before." Sarah had found more than a job. She had found herself. And in the process, she had rediscovered her faith, not just in God, but in her own strength. Her journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she faced the future with confidence. knowing that even in the hardest times, blessings were waiting just around the corner. As Sarah reflected on her journey, she saw her struggles through a different lens. What once felt like insurmountable pain and endless challenges now seemed like stepping stones, each one pushing her toward a greater purpose. She realized that the hardships she endured were not punishments, but lessons. Opportunities to grow, adapt, and find strength she didn't know she had. Losing her job had forced her to let go of the familiar and embrace the unknown. Jake's illness reminded her of the depth of a mother's love, and the lengths she was willing to go to protect her child. And even the scam that left her feeling defeated taught her to rely on her instincts and never lose hope, no matter how dark things seemed. Each moment of despair had been part of a greater plan, one that she couldn't see at the time, but now she understood. Sarah smiled as she watched Jake playing in the bakery, his laughter filling the room. She thought about the woman she was just a few months ago, broken, hopeless, and questioning everything. And now, she felt a deep gratitude for all she had been through. Those trials had led her to this moment, a moment where she stood not just as a survivor, but as someone who had found purpose and joy in the wake of her pain. Pain isn't here to punish us, Sarah thought. It's here to guide us to something better, something we might not have reached on our own. Her journey taught her one profound truth. Faith isn't about avoiding hardship. It's about having the strength to face it head on, trusting that God's plan is far greater than anything we can imagine. Even when the path is unclear, even when the weight feels unbearable, there's always a purpose to the struggle. To anyone who might feel like the world is against them, Sarah's message is simple. Don't give up. Keep moving forward. Even in your darkest moments, trust that something greater is waiting for you on the other side. Because sometimes, the most beautiful blessings are born from the hardest trials. As Sarah looked out the bakery window, the sun casting a warm glow over the streets, she whispered a quiet prayer of gratitude. Thank you, Lord, for never leaving me. Your plan was always greater than my pain. Her story is a reminder for us all. The journey may be difficult, but the destination is worth every step. Trust in the process and never lose faith. Sometimes, the best things in life come from the moments we least expect.